We've been looking all summer at the topic of relationships and how the gospel comes in and transforms the relationships that we have with others. And last week we looked at the topic of sexuality, and I said last week this would be kind of a two-part sermon. We're going to look at this topic twice. And I also said last week that I realized that this is one of these topics that does cause at least a little bit of awkwardness. It is kind of a theme that we're not always so used to talking about in public. And so if you're sitting here this morning and you're a little bit unsure of what to make of all this and how to sit through it, then I'm going to tell you that I don't feel all that sorry for you, and I'll tell you why. Does that sound insensitive? I'm sorry. But I'm not sorry that you feel awkward, and here's why. A few years ago, it was the first time that I ever preached on the topic of sexuality. And I had kind of put together my preaching schedule, usually a few months in advance, and I had picked out a day that this was going to happen. And already I'm kind of, a little nervous about this. A few weeks before, my mom calls me up, and she says, "Hey, I'm coming for a visit." I says, "Well, that's great. When are you going to come and visit?" She tells me the weekend, and it's like almost the first thought in my mind, oh no. And so I had to preach a sermon on sex with my mom sitting right in the congregation. And so I don't feel sorry for you this morning if you're a little awkward, because try doing that and then talk to me about being embarrassed or feeling awkward. In all honesty, in all seriousness, I do realize this is a somewhat delicate topic, and what I said last week is that the whole world is talking about sex and sexuality. You are hearing messages almost nonstop, it feels sometimes, right? Whether you're listening to music, whether you're watching TV, whether you're watching movies, whether you're on the internet, the messages are everywhere about sex and sexuality and what it means and the place that it plays in our lives together. And what we as Christians need to learn to do is hold up a better narrative, a better story about the meaning of sex and sexuality. And it occurred to me as I was getting ready for this message and as I was looking into the Song of Songs, there is no other book in the Bible that is devoted to one single theme. There's no book in the Bible that is focused, for example, entirely on the topic of money. There's no book of the Bible that focuses only on the topic of work. There's no other book in the Bible that talks about just parenting. When you come to the Song of Songs, here we have a whole book dedicated to the theme of sexual intimacy in the context of marriage. And so already you get the sense that this is something important that God wants to speak to his people about. This is something that we need to really reflect on and take to heart, because when you get at what the Bible is teaching, you see, number one, it's not just about sex. It points to something far bigger and far greater. And number two, you see that God's design for sexual intimacy is it's a far better story than what the world has to offer. So what we're going to do this morning is just a little different. As I said, normally when we preach here, when I preach, I'll look at a chapter or a paragraph, and we'll spend the whole time just on that one chapter or that one paragraph. And the reason we do that is because that's usually the best way to pull out the meaning of a text and to hear what God is saying. We're not doing that this morning because the picture of sexuality that's presented in the book, The Song of Songs, there are things that I want to draw out that are kind of scattered throughout the book. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at a number of the themes that are woven through the whole book. And I'm going to try to draw your attention as we move through to what some of those themes are. Now, here's the thing. The church has not always known what to do with a book like the Song of Songs. It's not always known how to interpret it or how to apply it or how to explain it. And sometimes, probably because the content is so graphic and it's so vivid and there's some discomfort or maybe some embarrassment around it, what has often happened in the history of the church is really, really smart, intelligent, gifted theologians they've spiritualized it. They've put meaning onto the text that wasn't really meant to be there. And I'm going to give you just one example to show you what I mean. If you just flip the page over to chapter 1, verse 13, And this will be about as PG as I get in this message. But here's what it says. And chapter 1, verse 13, this is the woman speaking to her husband, or about her husband. She says, "My lover is to me a sachet of myrrh resting between my breasts." And what early church leaders, one named Origen, who was otherwise a brilliant thinker, he said, well, that cannot possibly mean what it sounds like. Instead, what that really is talking about is talking about Jesus between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Now, I tell you that just to give you a sense of how the church has kind of wrestled with what do you do with a book like the Song of Songs? What do you do with a book where the poetry is so vivid and so graphic, and there's a tendency to sort of push away from that and say, well, it doesn't really mean that. But there's no real warrant in the text for reading it other than the way that it means, other than the most obvious meaning. And so the frank conclusion is that, yes, this book really is about that. The book really is about human sexuality. Now, the next sort of preliminary thing I think is important to note is that, well, how do you make sense of the book as a whole? Some people have looked at this and said, well, it's a story. It's a narrative. It's about two people, they meet and they fall in love and they get married. I don't think there's any sense in trying to look for a story, because you really have to strain to find any kind of narrative. I think the best way to look at it is just to understand this is a collection of love poetry. It's an anthology. It's a collection of poems that celebrate the goodness of human sexuality as a gift from God. There's no overarching story with a beginning, middle, and an end. It's like opening a book of poetry, pulling a book off your bookshelf with poems and reading it. Now, next question that maybe we should just clear up. Who wrote the book and why? I was leading a marriage conference in Colorado a couple of years back, and I was talking about the Song of Solomon. I was trying to explain the meaning and some of the themes in it, and someone came up to me afterwards and said, well, I really like what you're having to say, except for I have one problem. I said, well, what's that? He said, well, you're telling us that this is a book about the goodness of human sexuality, but you know what? Solomon, was he really one to give advice on that? I mean, here's a guy that was married to 300 women and he had 700 concubines, and he's going to tell us about God's design for marriage and sexuality? And I realized, yeah, that's a good point, but I also realized I forgot to make the case that probably this book was not written by Solomon. Now, I'm not going to go into all the arguments for that. I'm just going to say that the very first line there where it says, a song of Solomon, or that's a translation that can mean anything from in memory of Solomon, in honor of Solomon, dedicated to Solomon. When you read through the book, you're getting a picture of two people who are exclusively committed to one another, and that doesn't fit with what we know of Solomon at all. And there's also one reference to Solomon in the book, and it's not a very positive one. And so it seems unlikely that Solomon would tell about himself and put himself in a negative light. So most likely this is a book written about maybe not even a particular couple, but a married couple enjoying the goodness of God's design for sexuality. Now, here's why I think this is important. See, some of us have maybe been raised in a home, or you've been taught that sex is really something that has to be controlled and managed. Like it's when you're growing up, it was always a cause for embarrassment. Your parents maybe never talked to you about it all that much. You get to be about 12, 13 years old, and your parents hand you a book and say, go read that. If you have questions, come and ask me. Right? Sexuality was a topic that was just avoided. And then when you get to youth group, you'd hear youth group lessons and youth group talks, but the focus was always on, here's all the things you better not do. Here's all the rules. And if you ever heard a sermon at all on the topic of sex or sexuality, it was, again, usually the thou shalt nots. And so maybe you never heard a very positive description of what God intends sex and sexuality to look like. And then you get married and you move into marriage, and it's hard to shed some of those old ways of thinking. It's hard to just get rid of that. You find that some of that mentality hangs on. You find that you never talk about it with your kids. You find that it's always something that's really uncomfortable and embarrassing to talk about. And so the Song of Solomon, one of the main messages here is that God is not shy or awkward or embarrassed or uncomfortable at all on the topic of sex and sexuality. God is actually far more vivid and far more graphic than we might even think to imagine. God is very open about it. He puts his blessing on it. And I'm going to show you just a couple of passages just to make that point. Look with me first at the text that we started with, chapter 1, verses 2 through 4. Many have noted that it's the woman who begins the speech. It's the woman who speaks first in this poetry. And she's going against many cultural assumptions. She's taking the lead. In fact, if you go through the whole book, it's the woman's voice that is the dominant voice. And she speaks up right from the get-go. Let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth. She starts off strong. And by verse 4, she's already saying, let the king bring me into his chambers. And of course, she's expressing her desire for marital union with her husband. She's expressing deep desire for him. Now, go with me a little bit further. Flip over to chapter 5, and let's start at verse 10. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I'm going to just take you real quickly through this, because what's happening, we start in verse 10, and this is the woman, this is the wife, and she's describing her husband, and what she's doing is she's going top down. She's starting describing him entirely, and it's like she's just delighting in him. My lover is radiant and ruddy. His head is pure as gold. His hair is wavy and black as a raven. His eyes are like doves. His cheeks are like beds of spice. His lips are like lilies. His arms are rods of gold. His body is like polished ivory. His legs are pillars of marble. This is a woman who looks at her husband and absolutely delights in him and enjoys him. Now, not to be outdone, the husband does the same thing. If you go ahead to chapter 7. Now, I have to tell you, when I was in 4th grade, my 4th grade teacher, she told me about this. She says, did you know, kids, there's a book in the Bible where it says, my nose is like the Tower of Lebanon. And she says, I hope my husband never calls my nose looking like a tall tower. But, of course, that's the power of imagery, isn't it? Look with me, chapter 7. And now the woman begins to, he begins to describe her. And he starts with her feet, and it's like he's looking up as he describes. He says, how beautiful your sandaled feet. Your graceful legs are like jewels. Your navel is a rounded goblet. Your waist is a mound of wheat. Your breasts are like 2 fawns. Your neck an ivory tower. And on it goes. You see what he's doing? He is absolutely delighting in the appearance of his bride. And the power of imagery and the power of these, someone once kind of sketched out a picture of what this woman would look like if you took it literally, and this was one weird-looking woman, but of course, it's an image. It's meant to draw our imagination. It's meant to it's meant to appeal to our senses so that we delight in what God has created. And this woman and this man are absolutely delighting in one another and experiencing the joy of attraction and desire. And that's God's way of putting his blessing upon that. And we should note one more thing, because some of you, it's not that you were raised in a home where sex was never talked about and it was something shameful and you always had to keep quiet about it. It's actually kind of the opposite. Or maybe that's kind of where you're at today. Right? You sort of sound like what the culture says. Sex is not, we shouldn't be repressive. We shouldn't try to keep it down. It's a power. It's good. And the only real limits are as long as you aren't hurting anybody else. And as long as as long as you both are in agreement, then it doesn't matter what you do. But that's where I think it's really important to note the other side of this. Because the Song of Songs doesn't just talk about the goodness of sexuality. It puts it in the context of covenant. One of the images that's repeated throughout the whole book is the theme of a garden. And the garden, of course, is in part a way to draw our minds back to the Garden of Eden, where God creates Adam and Eve and places them in that relationship and in that covenant together. The other thing is that goes along with the theme of the garden is that the garden is often talked about as being locked. This is a place of exclusivity. This is a place where only the man and the woman have access together. So there's that picture that sex is not just a free-for-all. It's something that two people enjoy together exclusively for one another. And by the time you get to chapter 8, verse 6, there's a verse where she says, "Let him place him like a seal over my arm." Now, what's a seal? Well, oftentimes a seal would be something that you would use to guarantee a covenant. She's using that covenant language really to say, we need to be exclusively committed. I only want you. And of course, that's the biblical design. We said this last week that sex is not just something we do physically. It's a way that we give ourselves wholly, entirely to another person. You pledge your whole life to that person. You make a commitment and a covenant and a promise. And then giving yourself away sexually is a way of giving your whole person over. And that theme is echoed through the Song of Solomon. Sex is not just an appetite. It's not just a passion. It's something that happens in the context of covenant. Now, in some ways, this is like a fairy tale picture. You have these two young lovers, and they are expressing their desire and their passion for one another. And you could look at that and say, well, the Bible just has this very lofty picture. But here's the thing. When you go through the Song of Songs, you find that the Bible is also very, very honest about the realities of sexuality. So let me show you what I mean by that. There's two things that come out. Come with me to chapter 2. And I just want to read verses 14 and 15. This is the man speaking. And he starts out like this: "My dove in the clefts of the rock, in the hiding places on the mountainside, show me your face. Let me hear your voice, for your voice is sweet and your face is lovely." Stop right there for just a moment. He's calling out for his bride. They're in some kind of a mountain cleft vineyard kind of thing. And of course, his real desire is for intimacy with his wife. He's expressing that longing. He's calling her to come to him. And the anticipation builds and the expectation builds. And then just as soon as the text reaches that high point, what happens? Catch for us the little foxes, the foxes that ruin our vineyards, the vineyards that are in bloom. Now, not literal foxes. It's not like all of a sudden these little animals started running around. What the poet is saying is that something has happened. Something has moved in to interfere with their coming together. Something is threatening their union such that if they don't deal with that, it's going to destroy the vineyard. Again, the vineyard, thinking about the vineyard being a picture for this intimacy. There are foxes that threaten intimacy. And sometimes those foxes, in marriage, they can range from a lot of different things. Sometimes you hit that season of life where you're just busy all the time. You got young kids at home. You're stressed. You spend your whole day going to work and then bringing your kids here and there and everywhere, and by the time you get to the end of the day, you're just exhausted. And you know what? That happens from time to time, and that's normal, but it can also become a pattern. And over time, it can do damage to the relationship. Sometimes it's something maybe a little more rooted in human sinfulness. Sex can be used to control. It can be used to manipulate. It can be used to assert power over the other person. You do this for me, and then okay, we can be intimate. Those are foxes. And maybe the fox is even more serious. Maybe it's that multi-billion-dollar industry, pornography, which promises harmless fun. And yet more and more studies and research is showing that it can do such incredible damage It's a fox. It's a fox. And what Song of Songs says is you've got to catch those foxes. You've got to identify them. You've got to sit down and you've got to talk about what they are. Because if you don't address it, if you don't seek help, if you don't seek guidance, if you don't work together to address those issues, then over the long run it can eat away at the health of your marriage. It can do damage. So that's the first thing. Then come with me one more. There's another, it's kind of like a story within a story. If you go to chapter 5, we were already in chapter 5, but we were in the later part of the chapter. Now you get to verse 2, and this is the woman speaking, but she's also quoting what her husband is saying. She says, I slept, but my heart was awake. Listen, my lover is knocking. And then the husband says, open to me, my sister, my darling, my dove, my flawless one. My head is drenched with dew, my hair with the dampness of the night. He's expressing his desire to be intimate with his wife. Some of the imagery there is a little unclear why his hair is damp. It could be he was out running around in the night or something. No one really knows for sure. But whatever the case, he comes and he's seeking intimacy with his wife. And she responds. Verse 3. I've taken off my robe. Do I have to put it on again? I've washed my feet. Do I have to get them dirty again? It's really just a way of saying, not tonight, honey. And then, if you go a little further in the text, and I won't read it exactly, but you can go and refer back to it later, she changes her mind. She actually decides, well, maybe this would work. But by that point, it's too late. The opportunity is gone, and the rest of the chapter tells about her going out into the night and seeking her husband again and looking for him. And probably this is not meant to be interpreted as a literal story of her leaving and running around the city, but it's more meant to describe that longing, but the moment is gone. And the chapter ends in suspense. Right? I'm looking for my lover, but I don't know where he is. If anyone sees him, tell him to come back. And that too is a picture, isn't it? It's a picture that can describe the honest realities and frustrations within marriage. Mismatched desire, mismatched expectations, miscommunication. That can be anything from, you wait until you're married. You want to honor God's plan and design for marriage, and so you wait and you're expecting that this is just going to be great. Once you get married, and then you find that it doesn't always work like that. And it leaves one or both of you frustrated. Right? There are realities that creep into married life. There are frustrations. There are miscommunications. And sometimes those honest realities can be a cause for real pain. In fact, as you look out at this picture that the Bible paints of human sexuality, this Song of Songs picture, this grand design, what's one of the most obvious things that can get in the way of that? Well, one of them would be this history of pain, mismatched expectations, rejection. See, when that becomes a reality, when that becomes a pattern, the pain cuts very, very deep. And it's so hard to be vulnerable, and it's so hard to be intimate. It's so hard to be open in that way when there's been so much pain. So one of the things that stands in the way most clearly here, one of the things that can get in the way most obviously of what God is presenting is our past sin, our guilt, our failures. Maybe you've made mistakes in the past. You've done things that you know have hurt your spouse or they've hurt you. There's guilt there. Maybe you've struggled with pornography, and you're only now beginning to see the damage that it can do in marriage. Maybe you didn't honor God's intention for sex, and even still, those feelings of guilt can linger. What do you do? How do you recover the intimacy that's being described here. John Piper, in one of his books on marriage, John Piper is a theologian and pastor and an author, and he wrote a book on marriage, and one of the things that he said is if we want to experience this picture, one of the things that's really important, in fact, one of the things that's absolutely necessary is learning to trust in God's promises. And you're thinking to yourself, what in the world does that mean, and how does that have anything to do with sex? Well, here's what he's getting at. One of the promises that we need to trust is the promise of forgiveness. If you have acknowledged your sin, your sexual sin, even the most personal sins that you've struggled with, the things that cause the most shame, if you've acknowledged that before the Lord and you repent, then God says to you, you are forgiven through Christ. Now, it's true we don't always trust that right away. Sometimes we struggle to believe that. Sometimes we let the guilt still stand over us. But trusting God's promise means that that guilt is gone. God no longer holds it against you. And furthermore, God no longer holds it against your spouse. See, sometimes we fall into that trap of holding what they've done against them over and over and over again. We don't let go. Now, I realize that in our world and with our limitations, sometimes a wrong can be forgiven, and the wound can heal, but it leaves a scar. And that's just part of the reality that we live with. And over time, the scar even may fade, but it might always be there. But if you're to enjoy what God is describing here, trusting God's promise of forgiveness is so important. Trusting the power that He gives to overcome sexual sin and sexual temptation. Trusting that your past mistakes and failures no longer define who you are. Now, one final thought, one final message that I think needs to be heard when we come to this. You see, it's easy for some of us to look out at the world around us and we see sexual immorality and we see sexual brokenness. We see the way that God's design here for sex and sexuality has been so twisted and so distorted. And it's easy for us to kind of cluck our tongues and say, what a messed up world. Look at how bad all these people are. I think it's important for us to remember that when the Bible talks about sex and sexuality, it's talking about that, but it's also taking us deeper. It's saying, look to the longings beneath. G.K. Chesterton, he said it this way. He said, every time a man knocks on the door of a brothel, he is looking for God. And so whatever the sin might be, prostitution, in what Chesterton is saying, promiscuity, pornography, you realize that underneath that is a deep longing. It's a longing to be loved. It's a longing for joy, for satisfaction, for contentment. The problem is that by nature, you and I look to all the wrong things to fill that longing. You know, we look to money, we look to power, we look to all kinds of other things. We also look to sex. We look to this to say, if I just had the perfect sex life with my husband or my wife, if someone would just love me, then I'd be complete. And what the Bible says to that is, don't ever make the mistake of looking at the signpost instead of looking to what that signpost points us to. In other words, the Bible, remember, is always saying, you want to understand God and His love for us, marriage is a way that gives us a picture of that. And in that context, marriage is a picture that gives us a picture of the ultimate intimacy that we long for. It's the joy that's found in our union with Christ. The true joy that we are longing for, the true love that we are seeking after cannot be found ultimately in marriage. It cannot be found in sexuality. It's only found in Christ. And here's why that's good news. Some of you here are single. And you're thinking to yourself, so does this mean there's nothing for me? And the answer is, well, marriage points you to something bigger. It's pointing all of us to the joy of being loved by Jesus. It's pointing us to the joy of being joined to Him and being found in Him.